All right, folks, I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit more about Chapter 14, dealing with Civil War. But actually, before dealing with the Civil War, what I want to talk about is some of the other things that are happening besides the war or because of the war. Um, in the South, what you're going to get is you're going to get the home front. You're going to go ahead and get the policy that, listen, we got a limited number of people. We want to go ahead and put all the effort into it that we can. And so Robert E. Lee is going to be in charge of forming the Army of Northern Virginia. You're going to have the entire South go ahead and start to organize and start to volunteer. Folks, not everybody in the South is all about slaves. There are some people who are thinking that, listen, we are fighting the North. We're fighting these people who are coming down on us. We're fighting the people who are trying to change our entire way of life, and that they're trying to, constrict us. And so don't get the idea that it's always all about slavery as far as the South is concerned, because there's a lot of folks in the South who don't own slaves and don't particularly agree with slavery. There's also a lot of people in the North who do own slaves and think slavery is a good thing, but they're going to fight on other principles. A lot of people are receiving propaganda and being told why they're fighting, and that's not always the scenario. So I want you to know what we're looking at is we're looking at other actions happening. One of the things that the book talks about is the Militia Act. Here's the thing. You got a lot of people volunteering in the South. You got a lot of people volunteering in the North. Once we figure out that it's going to be a much longer and more convoluted war than we think, then what's going to happen is that Lincoln is going to put out the call for more troops. He's going to put out the call for a draft, and that's what the Militia Act is going to be. And this call for troops is actually going to trigger some further secessions. North Carolina doesn't originally secede, folks, but once we start calling for additional troops to go ahead and act to fight the South, North Carolina is going to go, whoa, hey, wait, this is not what we signed up for, and they're going to secede as well as a few other states. There's going to be a few border states that are undecided or who are forced to be undecided as well, but what we're going to see is we're going to start seeing the call for more troops in the North because we want to put together a more organized army. In addition, to one of the things that pops up in this is going to be something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. I was lucky enough to read a couple of papers. There's some people doing some research on modern medicine, and this is the introduction of modern medicine, folks, that prior to this, there's not a whole big discussion about germ theory. They're going to run into diseases. They're going to run into infections. They're going to run into a lot of different things. One of the things that they figure out in this Civil War, in this modern war, is, listen, if I shoot you and kill you, you die. If I shoot you and wound you, well, then two other people are going to have to carry your butt off the field. So I took 3 people out of the fight. And so we're going to introduce the idea of, yeah, we would like to go ahead and wound people. One of the things that we get is an introduction is almost a shotgun cannon in such a way that rather than necessarily a full cannonball, what they do is they take a lot of ceramic balls, they go ahead and pack it into a cannon in the canister, and when they're up close, they go ahead and fire the cannon with this, because what it does is it peppers a lot of people, wounding them, forcing them to be taken off the field, so they can take a lot more people out of action. The problem is what they're doing in this wounding people is we don't have a whole lot of practical information and policy about battlefield medics and battlefield triage, and so we can stop them from bleeding. One of the things, if it's broken and it's reduced to unusable, is we do an awful lot of field amputations. We get the introduction of some sedatives, but not nearly enough. When you are talking about field amputations, we're talking literally about a bone saw, or we're talking about an axe, and very often if we don't have enough sedatives or we don't have enough anesthesia to put the person out, they're going to be wide awake and screaming. So we do have the introduction of morphine at this time, but because of Dorothea Dix, because of Clara Barton, because of the introduction of nurses, because we really didn't have a whole bunch of nursing before this, we're going to introduce the idea that perhaps changing bandages, perhaps using certain medications, is going to be an advancement in the field of medicine that is going to cut down on infection, going to cut down on gangrene, is going to cut down on the diseases that are doing most of the killing versus, the guns and bombs doing most of the killing. And so that's a huge change. We're also looking at change on the public front. We're looking at the Pacific Railway Act. We're looking at the Homestead Act. We're looking at the introduction of the Department of Agriculture. We're looking at the Moral Land Grant College. And what we're trying to do is, while we're busy trying to fight a war and start a war, we're expanding westward. We're building this transcontinental railroad. We're establishing land grant colleges. We're saying, hey, listen, in between fighting wars and stuff like that, we're going to go ahead and open up the old Indian Territory portions of Oklahoma to push settlers west, because we can push settlers west that are union oriented. That will also, not only does it help push the Native Americans down, but it establishes the union control of the West and the Midwest, which is part of that particular idea. The Moral Land Grant College Act is huge, because what it does is it gives the states federal land to go ahead and sell, and they can use this money to establish land grant colleges, which are about agriculture, which are about farming, which is about well, the same thing they're about nowadays. This is the establishment of educating people in proper farming techniques. The National Banking Act, Internal Revenue Service, come up at this particular point is because we have to fight a war. And to fight a war, you've got to have funding. To create funding for a war, we're going to start issuing something called greenbacks. The idea of a greenback is, well, gosh, it's paper money backed by the U.S. government. Because prior to this, everything is backed by actual gold or actual silver. What we're going to do is we're going to start printing money in an inflationary way. It's going to be that greenback. It's going to say via this Legal Tender Act that only the federal government can do this. And then what we're going to do is use the Internal Revenue Service to create a progressive taxation system. Hey, you're paying taxes now. Well, hopefully you're paying your taxes. But if you're not, and your parents are, or somebody else is, the idea is how much you earn depends on how much you pay. We're going to start creating this internal revenue tax as a way to go ahead and fund the federal government and fund the fight in the Army. So there's a lot of stuff going on at this particular point that are funding the war, that are because of the war. There's some good changes. The Industrial Revolution kicks in at this point, so we get some huge technological changes that are going to affect how we produce arms and weapons. By the end of the war, we're going to be looking at a brand new weapon, something called a Gatling gun. We're going to start looking at the invention of the repeating rifle. We're going to look at a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, and it's driven by the war, because wars are horrible things, but wars are great for business. And because we are having a war at this particular point, we're going to look at some innovation and changes along the way. Now, you have to think about a couple of things real quick. The North and the South are not equal. Okay, the North is a port of entry. You've got New York, you've got Boston, you've got Philadelphia. All those are major areas that have an influx of immigrants from Europe. The South doesn't have any major points of entry. The closest they get to a major point of shipping and entry is going to be, gosh, that little bitty town. Oh, yeah, New Orleans. Okay, they're not doing a whole bunch of shipping out of any place else on an international basis, and they're not a major port of entry. So there's a lot of stuff happening at this point that you have to pay attention to. But what I want you to think about is the advantages and disadvantages. What does the North have? What does the South have? Because what I'm going to talk about in the next one is talk about the advantages in the North and the South, who has what, and then how this actually war goes about. I'm not going to go ahead and break down all the individual battles, because I expect you to actually do the reading. What I want to do is talk about some of the things the government does, because changes always happen with war. They always inflict things on your rights, but I want to talk about some of the things in the war itself, and we'll continue on from there. All right, thank you.